She had everything except what mattered most. Inside the marble halls of Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, an 8-year-old girl stood at a window watching her mother's carriage disappear down the drive. The year was 1885. The mansion behind her held 50 rooms, each more magnificent than the last. Chandeliers from Venice hung overhead, casting prismatic light across floors of Italian marble polished to such a shine that they reflected the painted ceilings above. Tapestries from France lined the walls, depicting hunting scenes and royal courts, their threads woven with real gold. Servants moved silently through corridors, their footsteps muffled by Persian rugs worth more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. The air smelled of fresh flowers arranged daily in crystal vases imported from Bohemia, and the faint scent of beeswax used to polish the endless wooden surfaces that gleamed under gaslight. Outside the window, manicured gardens stretched toward the Atlantic Ocean, their hedges trimmed into perfect geometric shapes, their fountains spraying water in choreographed arcs. But the little girl, Consuelo Vanderbilt, felt only one thing: loneliness. She pressed her small hand against the cold glass, leaving a print that would fade before anyone noticed. Her breath fogged the window, momentarily obscuring the view of her mother's carriage as it rolled past iron gates and disappeared onto Bellevue Avenue. Behind her, a governess called her name in a thick French accent. Mademoiselle Consuelo, venez ici. Time for lessons. Time for posture drills. Time to practice walking with books balanced on her head. Time to recite French poetry. Time to learn how to curtsy properly for royalty she had never met. Time to be molded into an heir, not a child. Consuelo turned from the window, her shoulders already trained to stay perfectly straight, her chin lifted at precisely the correct angle, her face already learning not to show emotion. She was 8 years old, and she had already mastered the art of hiding her feelings. She was being raised not by her parents, but by servants. Not to be loved, but to be displayed. Not to be happy, but to be perfect. This was childhood in America's Gilded Age. And she was not alone. Between the years 1870 and 1900, America transformed from a nation recovering from civil war into an industrial powerhouse that would reshape the global economy and establish the United States as a dominant force in world affairs. Railroads stretched across the continent, connecting east to west in ribbons of steel that carried goods, people, and dreams across thousands of miles of prairie, mountain, and desert. Steel mills roared day and night in Pittsburgh, their furnaces glowing red against the night sky, their smokestacks belching clouds that turned the air thick and gray. Oil fields pumped black gold from the earth in Pennsylvania and Texas, making fortunes overnight for men who had been farmers and laborers just years before. Coal mines dug deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, fueling the engines of progress and powering the factories that churned out products at a pace never before seen in human history. Factories rose in every major city from New York to Chicago to San Francisco, churning out textiles, machinery, tools, and consumer goods that would fill American homes and be shipped around the world. Immigration surged as millions arrived from Europe seeking work and opportunity, creating a labor force that built the infrastructure of modern America. And at the center of this explosion of wealth and transformation stood a handful of families whose fortunes grew so vast they rivaled the treasuries of entire nations. The Vanderbilts controlled the railroads, building an empire on tracks that carried goods and people across thousands of miles, generating profits that seemed endless. Cornelius Vanderbilt the Commodore had started with a single ferry boat and built a transportation empire that made him the richest man in America when he died in 1877, leaving a fortune of over $100 million. The Astors owned half of Manhattan, their real estate holdings making them America's first multi-millionaire dynasty. John Jacob Astor had arrived in America as a poor German immigrant and built his fortune through fur trading and strategic purchases of Manhattan land that would become some of the most valuable property in the world. The Rockefellers monopolized oil, creating Standard Oil, which controlled 90% of America's refineries, and made John D. Rockefeller the richest man in modern history. The Carnegies built empires of steel, their mills producing more metal than entire countries, and making Andrew Carnegie one of the wealthiest men on earth. The Morgans dominated banking, with J.P. Morgan financing the very infrastructure of American expansion, from railroads to steel mills to electric companies. These dynasties didn't just accumulate money, they built monuments to it. Mansions that stretched across city blocks, rising like palaces in the heart of New York City, where land was already precious and expensive. Country estates with hundreds of rooms sprawling across thousands of acres of carefully landscaped grounds. Private palaces designed to rival the courts of Europe, complete with ballrooms that could hold 500 guest libraries that contained tens of thousands of rare books and art galleries that could compete with any museum in London or Paris. The Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina boasted 250 rooms, making it the largest private home ever built in America. Construction began in 1889 and took 6 years to complete. The estate covered 175,000 square feet. It had 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, and 3 kitchens. The grounds, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park, covered 8,000 acres. The breakers in Newport, Rhode Island rose like a Renaissance palace above the Atlantic Ocean, its limestone facade gleaming in the summer sun. Built for Cornelius Vanderbilt II between 1893 and 1895, it contained 70 rooms spread across 5 floors. The Great Hall soared 50 feet high with walls of carved limestone and a ceiling painted to resemble the sky. Marble House, also in Newport, was built by William Kissam Vanderbilt as a birthday gift for his wife Alva. Construction cost $11 million in 1892, the equivalent of over $300 million today. The house contained 500,000 cubic feet of marble, imported from Italy. The ballroom was modeled after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, with walls covered in gold leaf. Inside these gilded walls, ballrooms glittered with crystal chandeliers imported from Bohemia, and gold leaf applied by Italian artisans brought to America specifically for these projects. Dining halls seated 100 guests beneath painted ceilings, imported piece by piece from Italian villas, and reassembled by master craftsmen who spent months ensuring every detail was perfect. Gardens stretched for acres, designed by the finest landscape architects money could buy, with fountains, sculptures, and rare plants brought from every corner of the world. To the public, these families lived like royalty. Newspapers printed breathless accounts of their parties, their jewels, their travels to Europe, where they were received by kings and queens. The New York Times and the Herald ran society columns that tracked every detail of their lives: what they wore to the opera, which charity balls they attended, how much they spent on a single dinner party. Photographers captured them stepping from carriages in silk and fur, their faces serene and confident. Society columns tracked their every move, analyzing their fashion choices, their guest lists, their social strategies. But behind the grand facades in the quieter wings of these massive estates, something far less glamorous was happening. The children of these dynasties were growing up in silence, distance, and profound emotional isolation. They were being raised not by their mothers and fathers, but by an army of hired help, and they were learning early that wealth could buy everything except love. The architecture of these Gilded Age mansions revealed a deliberate and carefully planned separation between parents and children. Unlike middle-class homes where families gathered in shared spaces around dinner tables and parlor fires, where children played in the same rooms where their parents read or worked, these palaces were designed with distinct zones that kept family members apart for most of the day and night. The adults occupied the main floor's grand suites with private sitting rooms, dressing chambers, and bathrooms fitted with marble imported from Carrara, Italy, and gold fixtures crafted by European metalsmiths. The master bedrooms were enormous, often larger than entire apartments, with separate spaces for sleeping, dressing, receiving visitors, and bathing. Alva Vanderbilt's bedroom at Marble House featured walls covered in silk damask imported from France, a bed draped in French lace that had taken seamstresses months to create, and a private balcony overlooking the ocean, where she could take her morning coffee without being disturbed. William Vanderbilt's suite included a study lined with rare books bound in leather, a smoking room with walls paneled in dark wood, where he could entertain male guests, and a bathroom with a bathtub carved from a single block of marble that had been shipped from Italy and required 12 men to carry it into the house. The children lived elsewhere. Entire wings were dedicated to nurseries, schoolrooms, and playrooms, often located on upper floors, or in separate buildings entirely far from the main entertaining spaces where adults gathered. At the Biltmore Estate, the children's quarters were tucked away in a distant corner of the 3rd floor, far from the grand banquet hall, where George Vanderbilt entertained guests, and far from the library where he spent his days reading and collecting rare books. At Marble House, Consuelo Vanderbilt's bedroom was positioned so she could not hear her parents' voices or footsteps. The nursery wing had its own staircase used only by servants and children, ensuring that the sounds of childhood laughter, tears, or tantrums would never disturb the adults below or interrupt a dinner party or a game of cards. The rooms themselves were surprisingly plain compared to the opulence of the rest of the house. While the adult spaces featured gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork, the children's rooms had simple furniture, plain walls, and small windows. The message was clear. Children were to be kept separate, managed by staff, and presented to their parents only at scheduled times. This wasn't neglect born of poverty or ignorance. It was intentional. It was a philosophy. The wealthy families of the Gilded Age imported their parenting philosophy directly from European aristocracy, where emotional distance was considered proper upbringing and necessary preparation for the responsibilities of wealth and status. In England, the upper classes had long practiced this separation. Children were raised by nannies and governesses in nursery wings, seeing their parents only briefly each day, usually for a formal visit in the drawing room before dinner. The same model was adopted by wealthy Americans who aspired to match European refinement and prove that American wealth could produce the same level of sophistication as European nobility. Children were heirs, not individuals. They were investments in the family legacy, not people to be nurtured for their own sake. Affection was seen as weakness. Closeness was considered spoiling. The prevailing belief was that too much parental attention would make children soft, dependent, unable to handle the responsibilities that came with great wealth. Better to raise them with discipline, structure, and emotional distance. Better to prepare them for a life of duty rather than a life of happiness. The result was a generation of children who lived surrounded by luxury but starved for love. The people who actually raised these children were not their parents. They were servants. Nannies, governesses, tutors, and nursemaids became the primary caregivers, spending more time with the children than anyone else in their lives. Many of these women were immigrants drawn to America by the promise of work and wages they could never earn in their home countries, where opportunities for women were limited and poverty was widespread. Irish nannies fleeing famine and poverty brought with them a warmth and storytelling tradition that provided comfort to lonely children. They told tales of fairies and heroes. They sang lullabies in Gaelic. They held children when they cried and whispered that everything would be all right. German governesses, trained in strict discipline, enforced rigid schedules and proper behavior. They woke children at the same time every morning. They insisted on perfect table manners. They corrected posture and pronunciation with sharp words and sometimes sharper punishments. French tutors hired to teach language and culture filled the children's days with lessons in grammar, literature, and etiquette. They taught children to speak French fluently because it was the language of sophistication and culture. They read French poetry and novels. They discussed French history and art. English nursemaids, who brought with them the rigid protocols of British aristocracy, taught children how to sit, stand, walk, and speak like members of the upper class. They drilled children in the proper way to enter a room, the correct way to greet someone of higher or lower social rank, the appropriate topics of conversation for different occasions. These women fed the children, preparing their meals in the nursery kitchen and ensuring they ate properly with the correct utensils and manners. They bathed them, scrubbing small bodies in porcelain tubs filled with warm water and drying them with soft towels. They dressed them, lacing up shoes, buttoning countless buttons on elaborate outfits, and tying ribbons in little girls' hair. They put them to bed, tucking in blankets, reading stories in quiet voices, and sitting beside them until they fell asleep. They wiped away tears when children fell and scraped their knees, offering comfort that parents rarely provided. They soothed nightmares, holding frightened children in the dark and promising that monsters were not real. They celebrated small victories, a first word, a successful piano recital, a well-executed curtsy, praising children in ways their parents never did. In every meaningful way, they were the mothers and fathers, but they were also employees. They could be fired at any moment for any reason. A child becoming too attached, a parent feeling threatened by the bond between child and caregiver, a minor infraction of household rules. They maintained professional distance even as they provided emotional care. They were taught never to overstep, never to assume a role that wasn't theirs. and the children learned early that love was conditional, temporary, and transactional. One of the most heartbreaking examples was Barbara Hutton, heiress to the Woolworth fortune. Born in 1912, Barbara lost her mother to suicide when she was just 5 years old. Her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, had struggled with depression and the crushing pressures of wealth and social expectations. She had married Franklin Hutton, a stockbroker, but the marriage was unhappy. Franklin was cold and distant. Edna felt trapped and alone despite living in a mansion filled with servants. One morning in May 1917, Edna was found dead in their New York apartment. She had suffocated herself. The official story was an accident, but everyone knew the truth. Barbara's father, Franklin Hutton, emotionally shattered and unable to cope, retreated into his own grief and his work. He could barely look at his daughter without seeing his dead wife. Barbara had her mother's eyes, her mother's smile. Every time Franklin saw her, he was reminded of his failure to save Edna. So he did what wealthy men of that era did. He hired people to raise his daughter. Barbara was raised entirely by a rotating staff of nannies and governesses. She lived in a massive apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The apartment had 20 rooms. Barbara had her own wing with a bedroom, a playroom, and a schoolroom. But she was alone. The one constant in her early life was a kind Irish nanny named Tikkie, whose real name was Germaine Tosh. Tikkie was warm and affectionate, in a way that no one else in Barbara's life was. She held Barbara when she cried. She sang her to sleep with old folk songs. She told her stories of Ireland and made her laugh. She played games with her and let her be a child. Barbara adored her. She was the only person who made the massive echoing apartment feel like home. Tikkie was the only person who seemed to love Barbara for who she was, not for her money or her name. Then when Barbara turned 12, the nanny was dismissed. It was standard practice in wealthy households. Children of a certain age no longer needed nursemaids. They were expected to be more independent, more refined, more grown up. Barbara was devastated. She begged her father to let Tikkie stay. She cried for days. She refused to eat. She locked herself in a room. But Franklin refused. He said Barbara was too old for a nanny. He said she needed to grow up. Tikkie packed her bags and left without a proper goodbye. Barbara watched from her bedroom window as the woman who had raised her walked out of the building and disappeared into the New York streets. Barbara never saw her again. She never recovered from that loss. For the rest of her life, she searched desperately for the love that had been taken from her. She married 7 times. First to a Georgian prince, then to a Danish count, then to Cary Grant, the movie star, then to a Russian prince, then to a Dominican playboy, then to a German tennis player, then to a Cambodian prince. Each marriage ended in heartbreak. The men married her for her money. She knew it, but she didn't care. She just wanted someone to love her. She struggled with anorexia, starving herself as a way to exert control over a life that had always been controlled by others. At her thinnest, she weighed less than 90 pounds. She battled depression that grew worse with each passing year. She turned to alcohol and pills to numb the pain. Despite inheriting $50 million in 1933, one of the largest fortunes in America, she spent it all. She gave millions to her husbands. She bought jewels and clothes and houses trying to fill the emptiness inside her. By the time she died in 1979, she was nearly penniless, living in a small apartment in Los Angeles. She died alone. No husband, no children nearby, no friends. In her final years, she said quietly to a reporter who had tracked her down, "I have never known what it feels like to be loved." She was 76 years old, and she was still that little girl watching her nanny walk away. Consuelo Vanderbilt was born in 1877 into one of the wealthiest families in America. Her father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, controlled a railroad empire inherited from his grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore who had built the family's fortune from a single ferry boat into a transportation network that spanned the nation. Her mother, Alva, was a force of nature, obsessed with social status, and determined to climb to the very top of New York society and stay there. Alva had been born, Alva Erskine Smith, into a wealthy Southern family in Mobile, Alabama, but the Civil War had destroyed their fortune. Her family lost everything. They moved to New York, where Alva grew up watching the wealthy elite from the outside. She was beautiful and ambitious, and she was determined to marry into money. She set her sights on William Kissam Vanderbilt and pursued him relentlessly. They married in 1875. Alva did not love William. She loved what he represented: money, power, a place in society. and she was determined that her children, especially her daughter, would secure the family's place among the American aristocracy, and if possible, marry into European nobility. From the moment Consuelo could walk, her life was not her own. She was a tool in her mother's ambition, a beautiful, obedient daughter who could be trained, molded, and eventually married off to European nobility, securing the Vanderbilt name among the aristocracy and bringing a title into the family. Consuelo's childhood was spent almost entirely in the care of governesses. She saw her mother only at scheduled times, 15 minutes before dinner, when Alva would come to the nursery to inspect her appearance and posture. A brief visit on Sunday afternoons when Consuelo was brought to the drawing room to recite poetry or play the piano for guests. During these encounters, Alva did not ask about Consuelo's day or her feelings or her dreams. She inspected her posture. Was her back straight? Were her shoulders back? Was her chin at the correct angle? Manners. Did she curtsy properly? Did she speak clearly? Did she make eye contact but not too much? Appearance. Was her dress pressed? Was her hair properly arranged? Were her hands clean? Any flaw was corrected immediately and harshly. Alva would snap her fingers and point out the mistake. The governess would rush to fix it. Consuelo would stand perfectly still, her face blank, trying not to cry because crying was forbidden. Consuelo learned to stand with books balanced on her head to perfect her posture. She would walk up and down the hallway for hours until her neck ached and her legs trembled. If the books fell, she had to start over. She was drilled in French, German, and Italian by tutors who spoke no English, forcing her to learn through immersion. She spent hours each day conjugating verbs, reading literature, and practicing pronunciation. She practiced curtsying, walking, and sitting for hours each day. There was a correct way to do everything, a correct way to enter a room, a correct way to sit in a chair, a correct way to hold a teacup. She was forbidden to cry, laugh too loudly, or show any emotion that might be considered unrefined. Her governess, a stern Frenchwoman named Mademoiselle Ruelle, enforced the rules with cold precision. There were no bedtime stories, no hugs, no warmth, just discipline and expectation. Mademoiselle Ruelle believed that children should be seen and not heard, that they should be obedient and perfect, that any sign of weakness was unacceptable. Consuelo's father was equally distant. William Kissam Vanderbilt spent most of his time managing business affairs, or traveling to inspect railroad lines and investments. When he was home, he barely acknowledged his daughter. He would nod briefly if they passed in the hallway, but he never stopped to talk. He never asked about her studies or her interests. He never told her he loved her. She later wrote in her memoir that she felt like a stranger in her own house. She would see her father at dinner sometimes sitting at the far end of a long table. He would talk to her mother, or to guests, but never to her. She was expected to sit silently and eat properly. The only affection she received came from her French governess, who occasionally softened and allowed Consuelo to sit beside her while she sewed. Those moments were the closest thing to love Consuelo knew. She would sit quietly watching the needle move in and out of the fabric, and she would feel almost safe. When Consuelo turned 18, her mother arranged a marriage to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Consuelo did not love him. She barely knew him. They had met only a handful of times, always under her mother's watchful eye, always in formal settings where real conversation was impossible, but Alva insisted. The marriage would elevate the Vanderbilt name and secure a duchess title. It would also bring a massive dowry to the Duke, who desperately needed money to maintain Blenheim Palace, his crumbling ancestral estate in England. The Duke needed $2.5 million. Alva was willing to pay it. When Consuelo protested when she confessed that she was in love with someone else, a young American man named Winthrop Rutherford, Alva exploded in fury. She screamed at Consuelo. She called her ungrateful and selfish. She locked Consuelo in her room and refused to let her leave until she agreed to the marriage. She threatened to kill herself. She told Consuelo that if she refused the marriage, she would be responsible for her mother's death. She said she would throw herself out the window. She said she would take poison. Consuelo, terrified and exhausted, and only 18 years old, finally gave in. She agreed to marry the Duke. On the day of the wedding, November 6, 1895, Consuelo walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in New York City in a gown that had cost thousands of dollars. The dress was made of white satin, with a train that stretched 18 feet behind her. It was covered in lace and pearls. She wore a diamond tiara. She looked like a princess, but tears streamed down her face. Guests whispered to each other. Photographers captured the moment. The newspapers called her the most beautiful bride of the season, but she looked like a prisoner, not a bride. The marriage was miserable from the start. Consuelo spent years in England, trapped in a loveless union living in Blenheim Palace, a cold, drafty palace that felt more like a museum than a home. The Duke was unfaithful. He had mistresses. He spent her money. He ignored her except when he needed something. Consuelo was lonely and isolated. She had 2 sons, but even they were raised primarily by nannies and governesses, just as she had been. She was repeating the cycle. It wasn't until 1921, after more than a decade of misery, that she finally divorced the Duke. It was a scandal. Divorce was almost unheard of in her social circle. Women did not leave their husbands, especially not duchesses. But Consuelo no longer cared about society's rules. She had spent her entire life performing for others. She wanted to be free. She remarried a French aviator named Jacques Balsan and finally found some measure of happiness. In her later years, she wrote a memoir titled The Glitter and the Gold, published in 1952. In it, she described her childhood with painful honesty. She wrote about the loneliness, the lack of affection, the constant pressure to be perfect. She called her upbringing a gilded cage. She wrote, "I was a prisoner in a palace of gold." She had everything, she said, except the one thing that mattered: love. The irony of the Gilded Age was stark and cruel and impossible to ignore. The children who had everything materially often had less emotional security than the children of the servants who raised them. In the basements and back wings of these grand estates, servants lived in cramped, simple quarters far from the marble halls and gilded ballrooms. Their rooms were small, barely large enough for a bed and a dresser, and maybe a small chair. Their furnishings were plain. No silk curtains or marble floors, no crystal chandeliers or imported rugs, just wooden chairs and simple quilts and walls that needed paint. But their children, when they were allowed to live on the estate, experienced something the wealthy heirs did not: freedom, warmth, affection. Servants' children played freely in the courtyards and gardens. They ran through the grass without worrying about getting dirty. They chased each other around trees and climbed fences and scraped their knees. They ate meals together, sitting around simple tables in the servants' dining hall, laughing and talking without fear of correction. No one told them to sit up straight, or use the correct fork, or speak only when spoken to. They were hugged when they cried. Their parents kissed their foreheads and told them they were loved. They were celebrated when they succeeded, even if the success was something small, like learning to tie their shoes or memorizing a poem. Their parents were present not because it was scheduled, but because they wanted to be. The wealthy children noticed. Sometimes they would watch from their windows as the servants' children played below. They would see the laughter and the freedom, and they would feel a longing they could not name. Sometimes they tried to befriend the servants' children. They would sneak down to the kitchens hoping to join in the laughter and warmth. They would slip out to the stables where the grooms' children played, hoping to be included in their games. For a few precious moments they would feel what it was like to be a normal child. But these friendships were quickly discovered and shut down. "Not appropriate for your station," the governesses would say, sternly pulling the child away. "You must not associate with those children. They are not your equals." The message was clear. Wealth created walls not just between families, but between human connection itself. The rich children had marble floors and silk dresses and tutors who taught them 5 languages. The poor children had dirt under their nails and hand-me-down clothes and parents who could barely read. But when it came to what truly mattered, the poor children were far richer. The Astor family was America's first dynasty of multimillionaires. Their fortune, built on fur trading and Manhattan real estate, made them the closest thing America had to royalty. John Jacob Astor I had arrived in America in 1784 as a poor German immigrant with nothing but ambition. He started by selling musical instruments and furs. He built an empire through shrewd business deals and ruthless ambition, buying up land in Manhattan when it was still cheap and holding on to it as the city grew around him. By the time of his death in 1848, he was the richest man in America, worth an estimated $20 million, the equivalent of over $500 million today. His descendants inherited not just his money, but his legacy and his name, and the weight of that legacy crushed the children who inherited it. Vincent Astor was born in 1891 into unimaginable privilege. His father, John Jacob Astor IV, was one of the richest men in the world. The family owned hotels, including the Waldorf Astoria. They owned office buildings and apartment buildings across Manhattan. They had estates in New York and Newport. But Vincent barely knew his father. He was raised by nannies and tutors in the family's massive estates. His father was always traveling, always working, always absent. Vincent saw him only occasionally, and when he did, the encounters were formal and cold. His father would ask about his studies, but never about his feelings. He would correct Vincent's posture or manners, but never offer a word of encouragement or affection. There were no games of catch, no bedtime stories, no moments of warmth, just distance. In 1912, when Vincent was just 20 years old, his father boarded the Titanic for a trip to Europe with his young second wife, Madeline. John Jacob Astor was 47 years old. Madeline was 18 and pregnant. They were returning from their honeymoon. When the ship hit the iceberg on the night of April 14th, John Jacob Astor helped his wife into a lifeboat. He asked if he could join her since she was pregnant. He was told no, women and children only. He stepped back. He was last seen standing on the deck smoking a cigarette as the ship went down. His body was recovered a week later. He had been crushed by a falling smokestack. Overnight, Vincent inherited $70 million and the responsibility of managing the Astor empire. He was 20 years old. He was unprepared. Despite his so-called perfect upbringing, despite the tutors and the discipline and the training, he had no idea how to handle the emotional weight of his father's death, or the pressure of his inheritance. He had never been taught how to grieve. He had never been taught how to ask for help. He had been taught to be strong, to be perfect, to never show weakness. Vincent struggled with alcoholism for most of his life. He drank to numb the pain, to escape the expectations, to forget the loneliness that had defined his childhood. He married multiple times, first to Helen Dinsmore Huntington, then to Mary Benedict Cushing, then to Brooke Marshall. Each marriage ended in failure. He was known for being cold, distant, and unable to form deep connections with anyone. Friends described him as a man who had everything but felt nothing. He threw lavish parties on his yacht. He donated millions to charity. But he was profoundly unhappy. In private letters discovered years later after his death, Vincent wrote, "I had everything but a childhood. The Astor name gave me wealth. It gave me power. It gave me a place in society. But it took away the one thing I needed most. A father who cared. A mother who held me. A childhood where I was allowed to be a child." The long-term consequences of this kind of upbringing were devastating and far-reaching, affecting not just the individuals who experienced it, but entire family lines for generations. Depression and anxiety were common among Gilded Age heirs. Many struggled with what doctors at the time called nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia, a term used to describe what we now recognize as clinical depression and anxiety disorders. The symptoms were the same as today: persistent sadness, inability to feel joy, withdrawal from social activities, difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite. But in that era, mental health was poorly understood and heavily stigmatized. People who struggled were seen as weak or morally deficient. Families hid their troubled members away. Substance abuse was rampant among the wealthy. Alcohol was the most common escape. Many heirs drank heavily at parties and alone in their rooms, trying to numb the pain of their empty lives. But many also used laudanum, an opium-based medicine that was legal and widely available in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was sold in pharmacies and prescribed by doctors for everything from headaches to insomnia. It dulled the pain, at least temporarily. It made the loneliness bearable. But it was highly addictive, and many became dependent on it. Eating disorders appeared frequently, particularly among women. Consuelo Vanderbilt struggled with her weight her entire life, a manifestation of the control issues that stemmed from her childhood. She had been controlled in every aspect of her life: what she wore, what she said, who she married. Food became one of the few things she could control. Barbara Hutton suffered from severe anorexia, starving herself as a way to exert control over a life that had always been controlled by others. At her thinnest, she weighed less than 90 pounds. Her bones protruded, her hair fell out, but she felt powerful. For once, she was in control. Failed relationships were almost universal among Gilded Age heirs. These children grew up without models of healthy attachment. They didn't know how to trust, how to be vulnerable, or how to love without fear. Their parents had been distant and cold. The servants who raised them had been warm but temporary. They learned that people left, that love was conditional, that attachment led to pain. Their marriages were often arranged, loveless, and short-lived. They married for money or status or because their parents told them to. They didn't know what real love looked like, and so their marriages failed. They divorced or stayed together in misery. They had affairs. They lived separate lives under the same roof. Suicide was not uncommon. Several members of the Vanderbilt family took their own lives over the generations. The so-called Vanderbilt curse became a whispered legend among New York society. People said the family was cursed, that their wealth brought only misery. In truth, it wasn't a curse. It was the predictable result of raising children without love. Wealth, it seemed, could not protect against despair. Medical records from the era show that many of these heirs spent time in sanitariums, private hospitals, where the wealthy were sent for rest cures. These facilities were located in quiet, rural areas. Patients were given bland diets. They were forbidden from reading or receiving visitors. They were told to rest and do nothing. The theory was that their nervous systems were exhausted and needed time to recover. But the real problem wasn't exhaustion. It was trauma. It was the emotional neglect they had experienced as children. Doctors noted in their records emotional underdevelopment and an inability to cope with normal life stresses. These were people who had been trained to be perfect but never taught to be human. They had been given every advantage except the one that mattered most: love. The mothers of the Gilded Age were not villains, though history has sometimes painted them that way. Many of them were victims of the same system. They had been raised the same way by distant parents and strict governesses. They had grown up in homes where affection was rare and discipline was constant. They believed genuinely that emotional distance was proper parenting, that affection would spoil their children, that preparing them for high society required discipline, not warmth. They were following the rules they had been taught. Alva Vanderbilt, for all her coldness and ambition, believed she was doing what was best for Consuelo. She wanted her daughter to have status, security, and a place in history. She wanted Consuelo to be a duchess, to have a title that would last forever. She didn't realize she was destroying her. She didn't understand that her daughter needed love more than she needed a title. In private letters written late in life, Alva expressed regret. She admitted that she had been too hard, too demanding. She wrote to Consuelo, apologizing for the pain she had caused. But by then, the damage was done. Consuelo had spent decades recovering from her childhood. The apology came too late. Other mothers tried to rebel quietly against the system. Some would sneak into the nursery at night after the governesses had gone to bed just to hold their children for a few moments. They would sit beside their sleeping children and stroke their hair. They would whisper, "I love you," when no one else could hear. They would write letters expressing love they could never say aloud. Letters that were hidden away in drawers and discovered only after their deaths. But they were trapped by social expectations. To show too much affection was to risk judgment from their peers. Other mothers would gossip. They would say she spoils that child. They would say she has no discipline. They would say she is common. To break the rules was to be seen as weak or unfit. And so they followed the rules. They kept their distance. They hired governesses and nannies. They scheduled brief visits with their children, and their children grew up believing they were unloved. The tragedy is that many of these mothers did love their children. They just didn't know how to show it. They had never been shown love themselves. They were repeating the only pattern they knew. By the early 1900s, cracks began to appear in the Gilded Age model of parenting. The progressive era brought new ideas about childhood education and emotional development. Psychologists began studying children and publishing findings that contradicted everything the wealthy had believed for generations. Affection, they said, was not spoiling. It was essential for healthy development. Emotional neglect, they warned, caused lasting harm that could affect a person for their entire life. Children needed love. They needed physical affection. They needed to feel safe and valued. These ideas were revolutionary. G. Stanley Hall, a pioneering psychologist, published studies on child development. Sigmund Freud was developing his theories about childhood trauma and its effects on adult psychology. The idea that childhood experiences shaped adult personality was gaining acceptance. Some of the children who had survived Gilded Age childhoods began to speak out. Consuelo Vanderbilt's memoir, published in 1952, shocked readers with its honesty. She described her childhood as a prison. She called her mother's ambition a form of cruelty. She wrote about the loneliness and the lack of affection. She wrote about being forced to marry a man she didn't love, and she vowed that she would never raise her own children the same way. The book was controversial. Some members of high society criticized her for airing private family matters, but many readers, especially women, wrote to her thanking her for telling the truth. Other heirs quietly sought help from early psychologists, then called alienists. They talked about their childhoods, their loneliness, their inability to connect with others. They described feeling empty, despite having everything. They described marriages that felt hollow. They described a sense that something essential was missing from their lives. Slowly, the idea that wealth could not replace love began to take hold. Parenting books began to emphasize the importance of maternal affection. Mothers were encouraged to spend time with their children. The rigid Victorian model of child-rearing began to soften, but change was slow. Many wealthy families continued the same patterns for generations. Boarding schools replaced governesses, but the separation remained. Children were still sent away at young ages to be educated far from home. Nannies were still hired to do the emotional labor parents avoided. The cycle continued quieter but no less damaging. Today, the great mansions of the Gilded Age stand as museums. Millions of visitors walk through their halls each year, marveling at the architecture, the art, the sheer scale of wealth on display. Tour guides describe the families who lived there, the parties they hosted, the fortunes they spent. They point out the gold leaf on the ceilings, the marble imported from Italy, the tapestries from France, the chandeliers from Bohemia. They tell stories about the grand balls where 500 guests danced until dawn. They describe the menus from dinners that featured 12 courses. They show photographs of the families dressed in their finest clothes. But they rarely talk about the children. The nursery wings are often closed to the public. The small plain rooms where the heirs actually lived are not part of the tour. The emotional reality of life in these palaces is hidden behind the beauty. If you walk through the Biltmore estate today, you will see the grand banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling and enormous fireplace. You will see the library with 10,000 books lining the walls. You will see the indoor pool glowing with tile and the bowling alley in the basement. You will see the gardens designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, stretching for acres. But you will not see the children's quarters tucked away in a distant corner of the third floor, far from the main rooms. You will not hear about Cornelia Vanderbilt, who grew up in that massive house feeling small and alone. If you visit Marble House, you will admire the gold ballroom modeled after the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. You will see the Chinese tea house perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. You will walk through rooms filled with priceless furniture and art, but you will not hear about Consuelo standing at the window watching her mother leave. You will not hear about the hours she spent alone with her governess practicing how to walk and sit and speak. The mansions are preserved perfectly. Every detail has been maintained. The paint colors are historically accurate. The furniture has been restored. The gardens are still manicured. But the stories of the children who grew up inside them are almost forgotten. And perhaps that is the final tragedy. Even in memory, they remain invisible. The tour guides talk about the adults, the powerful men who built these fortunes, the ambitious women who climbed the social ladder. But the children who suffered in silence are rarely mentioned. Their pain is not part of the official history. The pattern did not end with the Gilded Age. Wealthy families today still rely heavily on nannies, tutors, and boarding schools. Children are still sent away to be educated, still raised by hired caregivers, while parents focus on careers and social obligations. The justifications are the same. They have opportunities we didn't. They'll thank us later. This is how successful families operate. Modern parents tell themselves they are different. They say they spend quality time with their children. They say they are present in the important moments. But the research is clear. Child psychologists have spent decades studying attachment, and the findings are consistent across cultures and time periods. Presence matters more than presence. Emotional connection is not optional. It is essential for healthy development. Children need consistent caregivers. They need to feel safe and loved. They need physical affection. They need to know that their parents are there not just physically, but emotionally. Wealth does not protect children from trauma. In some cases, it creates it. The children of the Gilded Age were not unique. They were simply the most visible example of a truth that still applies today. No amount of money can replace a parent's love. No mansion, no matter how grand, can fill the emptiness left by absence. And no inheritance, no matter how vast, can heal the wounds of a childhood spent alone. Modern research on attachment theory confirms what these children experienced. Children who grow up without secure attachment to their parents often struggle with relationships as adults. They have difficulty trusting others. They fear abandonment. They may become anxious or avoidant in relationships. They may struggle with depression and anxiety. The effects can last a lifetime. And yet wealthy families continue to repeat the pattern. They hire nannies to raise their children. They send them to boarding schools at young ages. They prioritize work and social obligations over family time. They tell themselves it is for the best, that their children will have opportunities, that they will be grateful. But the children often grow up feeling the same way Consuelo and Barbara and Vincent did, lonely, unloved, like strangers in their own homes. Standing in the halls of these great estates today, it is easy to be dazzled by the beauty, the marble, the gold, the art. The sheer scale of wealth is overwhelming. It is hard to imagine having so much. Hard to imagine living in a house with 250 rooms. Hard to imagine having servants to meet your every need. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes. The footsteps of a child walking alone through empty corridors. The voice of a governess calling in a foreign accent. The silence of a nursery where no parent ever came to say goodnight. If you stand in Consuelo's bedroom at Marble House, you can imagine her standing at that window, 8 years old, watching her mother's carriage disappear, pressing her hand against the glass, feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by 50 rooms of luxury. If you walk through the Biltmore, you can imagine Cornelia Vanderbilt wandering through those endless hallways, playing alone in the gardens, eating dinner by herself in the nursery, growing up in the largest house in America, and feeling like she had no home. Consuelo Vanderbilt once wrote, "I was a prisoner in a palace of gold." Barbara Hutton said, "I have never known what it feels like to be loved." Vincent Astor admitted, "I had everything but a childhood." These were not the words of ungrateful heirs. These were not people who failed to appreciate their privilege. They were the words of people who had been given everything except what mattered most. They understood better than anyone that wealth could not buy happiness, that luxury could not replace love, that a mansion was just a building without warmth inside it. The mansions still stand. They are beautiful, they are impressive, they are monuments to American wealth and ambition, but the fortunes in many cases are gone. The Vanderbilt fortune was estimated at over $200 million in the late 1800s. By the time the last Vanderbilt died, there was almost nothing left. The money was spent, the investments failed, the mansions were sold or donated. But the lesson remains. Wealth can build walls of marble and towers of stone. It can fill rooms with treasures from across the world. It can create beauty that takes your breath away, but it cannot build a home. It cannot create the warmth that comes from a parent's hug. It cannot replace a bedtime story read in a gentle voice. It cannot substitute for the simple presence of a parent who cares. The children of the Gilded Age had everything: mansions, servants, jewels, clothes, tutors, every material advantage. And they had nothing. No love, no warmth, no sense of belonging, no feeling of being valued for who they were rather than what they represented. They were the richest children in America, and the loneliest. Their stories are a warning, a reminder that what matters most cannot be bought, that children need love more than they need luxury, that presence is more valuable than presence, that a small house filled with warmth is better than a palace filled with silence. Today, when we visit these mansions, we should remember the children. We should tell their stories. We should acknowledge their pain, because their voices deserve to be heard, and their lesson deserves to be learned. Wealth without love is poverty. A mansion without warmth is a prison, and a childhood without affection is a tragedy no amount of gold can erase.